always find these really weird because I can't see you. So I'm sort of just talking at screen. I can't see you. So if I feel like I'm getting distracted, so I'll try and keep the energy up. But I do find it very weird. If you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A at any point. Lauren's going to keep an eye on those, and I'll check in during the course of the session to just see if you've got any questions. If there's anything going along, don't feel like you have to save them all up for the end if there's something that particularly sparks a question. So my name is Tim Sismy. I have a small consultancy, it's just me, called Make Work Work Better. I look at process improvement and personal productivity, team cohesion, and I'm particularly interested in how those things impact well-being. So how the way that we work impacts how we feel, how the stresses that we put on ourselves in our work, and indeed in the way that we are measured, can impact our lives and our feet and the way that we feel in and outside of work. And today we're going to talk about measurement. So measurement is incredibly important for lots of reasons. I'm sure we all interact with measurement on daily bases. We have there are certain measures that we are bonused on. There are certain measures that we are targeted on. There are certain measures that we have to think about on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. But the problem with measures is that measurement is problematic, and there are kind of three, as far as I see it, three main problems with the way that most organizations do measurement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those three problems are, about the different kinds of measurements, and we're going to work through some tools for defining measurement and for defining scorecards that I think is helpful and that I think helps break down some of the problems that we deal with here. There is a resource. There are a couple of templates in the resource, which the resources tab that you could download. But I think Lauren's also going to pop the links in the chat to just. Can we do that, Lauren? I can't remember if we can do that or not.
We'll do that now, but yeah, it should be along your toolbar, similar to where your Q&A is. There's a section called resources. If you click in there, you should be able to access all three. But what I'll do is I will also pop them in the chat for everybody now.
So I'm going to talk through how we use those. If you want to play along at home and fill them in as we go along, then that is also something that we can do. And then you might be able to ask some questions about like real life examples, just so you can get the most value out of the next 45, 50 minutes as possible. So anyway, there are three problems with measurement as far as I see it. And the first one is you can't understand what you don't measure. Okay, you can't understand what you don't measure, and if you don't understand it, you can't change it. So I guess the irony here with measurement is that one of the problems with it is there is so much riding on it, and actually we treat them often as progress, but actually these are it's all about changing something within the business. 9 times out of 10, the reason that we have a measure or a change because we want a measure is because we want to change something. We don't often treat them like that. But you can't understand or change what you don't measure. So do measurements within your organization reflect the things that you need to understand or change, or are they just things that you've always measured? Question that I ask quite a lot is why do we measure certain things, and what's the implication of those things that we are measuring? So that's for me one of the initial challenges. That then gets compounded by the fact that most measurement is opaque or confusing. But often we have KPIs, performance indicators, whatever their targets, whatever they're called in your business, and everyone kind of takes them as read. But if you were to ask people to explain what they are, a lot of the time it's not entirely clear. So we can't change things in the organization if we're not measuring it, but often we don't understand what it is we really are measuring. We don't understand what that measurement is made up of, and often that measurement is made up of multiple things. I'll give an example of something that I mean by that. There was an improvement that someone I was working with was involved in, someone I was coaching was, and it was they worked in an airline, and the measurement that they were trying to influence was departure time, on-time departures. Now, turned out that depending on which stakeholder you spoke to in the business, on-time departure meant something different. If you spoke to the gate staff, on-time departure meant when they closed the gate. If you spoke to the ground staff, then on-time departure was when the plane pulled away from the terminal. And if you spoke to customers, on-time departure was when the plane took off. So it wasn't clear to those people. They all had different definitions, which means that actually doing any sort of change in that situation is very difficult. So most measurement is opaque or confusing. And the third piece is the behavior piece. So how we are measured determines how we behave. If we know that we are going to get bonused on a particular outcome, or if we know that we are going to get praised, or the other side of that, we're going to get a telling off if we don't hit certain measures, then we are going to act differently. So has anybody ever had the experience where they raise some kind of technical ticket, maybe an ID help desk, or their phone company call center, something like that, and so you raise a problem, you call and you ask for something to be done, and the ticket gets closed, but the thing isn't fixed. You get an email telling you that this ticket has been closed, and you're like, well, but staff still got the problem. And that's generally because those people are measured on how many tickets they close, not how many things they fix. And that influences the way that we behave. And so we need to think about that from our measurement system. Are we measuring, is the way that we're measuring things driving behaviors in the organization that we don't, that are undesirable, that we don't want to encourage? And how do we get around that? So we're going to talk a little bit now about the kinds of measurement. We all have, we're familiar with the idea of KPIs, I think, key performance indicators. Most of us will know what they are in our immediate world. There will probably be a big pack that you get at the end of the month where you go through them. You might even be asked to pull some of that information together yourself. And for the purposes today, that big blue blob is your KPI. And a KPI really is the outcome of a process. So there will be, now that process might be the entire process of an organization spending and receiving money that outputs into profit. Or it might be the outcome of an entire organization's safety and risk management structure, and the outcome of that is your fatality weighted index or your other safety KPIs that you might have to think about. But it's the output of a process, almost always. And that process is influenced by things that happen. So to go back to my first example, if that big blue KPI blob is profit, then the things that are going in the top are going to be revenue and salary costs and overhead costs and other things like that. So there are multiple inputs to our process that leads to our KPI. Now that sounds super straightforward when we talk about it like that. I realize that that's not going to be news to anybody, but we often don't think of the KPIs as the product of a process. We often think about them as a thing that exists in and of themselves. And that's where it becomes really difficult for us to, as people in an organization, especially if we have people, we are responsible for people who report to us, people who we have to have conversations and engage them in the delivery of the business. It's really hard to actually help people understand how we drive these things. So KPIs are generally the output of a process of some kind. And the thing is, I like this example because everybody understands it. If we look at this example, the 3 different pins we got in going into our process that lead to something, It's a bit like the difference between weighing yourself versus exercise. And so in that first example, when you weigh yourself, if you've ever tried losing weight and the way that you lose weight is you weigh yourself on a Friday and see how you've got on, it can be so frustrating because you can think so, well, I've put on 3 pounds this week, but I've been really good. I've not eaten anything I shouldn't have. I've done my exercise. How come I put on 3 pounds? Well, that's because the process by which we end up weighing what we weigh, the metabolic process that's going on in our bodies, and the multiple different things that can contribute to that, almost impossible to manage after the fact. We can't, we're managing a couple of them, but sleep makes a difference. Maybe if we've got underlying health conditions, they make a difference. When we eat makes a difference. All of this, there's lots and lots of inputs going into this, and so it really also, you might go and you're going, oh, I've lost a pound, but I don't know how I've done that because I was a bit slack on going to the gym this week and had a pizza last night. So it doesn't often make a lot of sense. But then you think about fitness trackers, and actually they're really, really clear because they tell you they're measuring those inputs, and you've got a really in the moment call to action. Okay, so this person's doing all right because it's only 10 past 10 in the morning, and that calorie burning ring is already quite a way round. But if this is like 8 o'clock at night and you've still got a bit of a way to go on your keeping fit schedule, it'll tell you go for a brisk walk for 20 minutes. That's something you can do in the moment, and you're keeping ahead of, so you're actively managing those inputs to the process in the moment. Which means hopefully when you get to Friday and you weigh yourself, the result that you see is a little bit more under your control, and also is a little bit more, what's the word? A bit less of a surprise. You've been looking after the measurements that are leading up, so that big one at the end is kind of taken for granted. You know where you're going to be at the end of the week. Now, keep this in mind. I find this a really, really useful analogy because weight is a composite measure made of lots and lots of different things. And quite often the measurable output of it is really confusing, and we don't know why it's where it is if we're not tracking the things that lead up to it properly. And so this is where we get into the different kinds of measures. So weight, profit, whatever it happens to be, is what often gets referred to as a lagging measure or an output measure. So that's where the thing that we are measuring, the blue blob, has happened in the past. It's in the rearview mirror. There's nothing we can do about it now. And most KPIs are lagging measures, but almost by their very definition. They are a performance indicator that looks at how do we do last quarter, how do we do last week, how do we do last year. This is not to say that they're not important, and they are how most businesses run, but they need to be managed and interrogated in the context of how we get to them, and they need to be understood in the context of how we get to them. The other kind of measure, so this is your fitness tracker information, are your leading measures, sometimes called input measures. And they're the things where we take an action and we measure that action, and through those actions we can be confident that the KPI in the future will be affected. So if we know that we go for, if we burn more calories than we take in on a daily basis, chances are, not necessarily, chances are that end of the week weigh-in is going to be less. If we bring in more money than we spend, then we are going to have a healthier profit at the end of the period. So leading measures are the things where we can control them and we can actually make decisions based on them. Okay. Some of this is probably really, really familiar, but it's worth us just making sure that the language is clear, because what we're going to get into shortly will I want to make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about before we start planning how we're going to address measurement. So this is a process that I find really, really useful. Some of you may be familiar with what's called a SIPOC diagram. And this is how I would talk an organization through identifying what those KPI measures are and what are the leading things that go into it. So SIPOC is an acronym that stands for suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. And this is a really nice way. I use this for quite a lot of things. It's a fairly common process improvement tool. And the three things that I use it for more often than not are getting a really high level overview of a process the first time that I come into contact with it. So getting the people who are involved in the process at different stages to talk me through, preferably together, how it all fits together and what happens. And that means that everybody agree, you get kind of a consensus and an agreement about how the process works. You also start to identify the language that people use at different points in the process. You can start to get a really good understanding of a good shared understanding of how it works. The other thing that I use it for is stakeholders. So the suppliers and the customers, they're the people who are involved in the process at different stages all the way through. And that means that you can often, doing this, you will get a much better list of all of the stakeholders who are involved in this process than you will if you just get people to go, well, who's involved, because you will always miss people. And the other thing it's super, super useful for is establishing what your measures are at different points on the process. And that's the context in which we're going to talk about it today. So this is what it might look like when it's filled out. And I'm going to just sort of talk you through each bit by bit. So the bit I would do first is I do the process at the bottom. Now you've got a template for this. So if you've got a process that you want to kind of improve the measurement of, I would recommend doing this, working through this first. Get a group of people together. Don't just do it by yourself. So the first thing I would do is go, right, what's our process called? This process is called widget installation. And you break it down into kind of like 5 or 6, usually no more than that, steps. How do those, and they're often where the big handovers happen, or so on and so forth. And you map them across the bottom. So you should be able to see this along here. This is the process area at the bottom here. And once you've done that, you think for each one of these steps, what do I need to complete this step, and who do I get that from? And that gives you your inputs. So what do I need to complete this step, and who do I get that from? So in this case, the installation is scheduled. So in order for us to get that, we need the customer details, we need the installation date and time, we need the widget type. And we get all of that stuff from the scheduling team. So that scheduling team sends us that information, and that goes into our that goes into our system, whatever it happens to be. And then after we've done that step, what does that create? There's always things that get created there, whether that's forms, whether that's phone calls, whether that's a entry into a database, but there'll be something that's created. So there'll be in this case, there's a completed work order, apparently, that comes out of this installation scheduling thing, and results, and that goes to the customer. So the customer knows that this work is happening. And so on and so forth. So for pre-installation checks, we need these photos so that we know that what we're dealing with, we get there. And we've completed pre-installation assessment, and so on and so forth. What this means, look, is that we get a big list of stuff here that enables us to go, oh, look, actually, I might have missed the ducting supplier, whatever they do, off a list of like my stakeholders to deal with, people who are involved in this process. But because we've captured it like this, we can see everyone who gets touched. Because this is important for, especially if you're trying to improve a process or you're trying to measure a process, you need to know everybody who's involved, because you need to know who you need to talk to and how things are going to be affected. So I'd recommend the SIPOC diagram as a way of getting your hands around what that process is, because in order to really solidly and confidently be able to put any kind of measurement in place, you need to understand what's going on. You need to understand what's in the process. Often KPIs are set without an understanding of the process, and very, very often targets are set without an understanding of the process. And that only becomes visible when those targets get right down to the front line. Well, there's no way we're going to get to that because there's no way we're going to be able to deliver each one of these widget installations in 35 minutes because it takes us 25 minutes to do this bit. And that's where then process improvement comes in, and you have to go, well, in that case, we need to reduce it, or we review our targets. So SIPOC is super, super useful for a number of things, but in this case, I think it's absolutely essential. I want to see if I just need to clear this annotation because I clear little drawings there. Sorry about that. The other way that you can do this, and that might be more familiar to some of you, because I know that bow tie diagrams are possibly a more recognizable tool for some of you, depending on what industry you work in. But you see these quite a lot in risk management. They still deal with input. They deal with things that happen before an event, things that happen after an event, usually. But you can use a similar kind of idea for mapping your input measures and your output measures going into the process. So what this doesn't give you is the idea of the process, the understanding of the process. So what I would tend to do would be to SIPOC, use a SIPOC first to understand the process, and then think about, on the left-hand side of this, where are all the things that I can measure that happen before the process? And what are all the things that I can measure that come out of the process? And on the far right-hand side, you're going to have your KPIs. On the far left-hand side, you're going to have all of the things that happen really far away from the things that happen the earliest in the process. And as we get closer to the process part of it, we'll have different kinds of measures. It's a good way of brainstorming. It's a nice visual way of brainstorming. What are all the possible measures that we could have? But you can't do unless you understand your process, which is why I would probably use a bow tie diagram like this in association with the SIPOC. SIPOC to understand the process, and then this to start brainstorming what measures might be available to us at the different parts of the process. So you'll see I've given you a template, and it's a slightly simplified version of a template that I really like. When we start with this template, there's really two things that we need to know. What's the output that we're trying to measure, and what is the process? So we've now understood our process. We've gone through a bit of our brainstorming session. We've gone, right, okay, so our process is widget installation, and our output is probably going to be something around like number of widgets we've installed, or how long does it take for us to install a widget. That's our starting point for the rest of the measurement process. Some processes will have multiple outputs, multiple KPIs. Some KPIs will be affected by multiple processes. So as I said, this is a simplified version, but I quite like going through one of these at a time, just trying to really simplify it, almost oversimplifying that initial piece and going, right, what do we know about this process and what do we know about these outputs? So you will see lower here, the bit that I've grayed out, we've not filled it in yet. We see these tick boxes. This is what we're going to talk about next. I'm just going to check, are there any questions at this point? Do we have anything drop into the chat or into Q&A, Lauren, as yet?
Just saying, great sharing. Can the templates be shared for us to use? So just a reminder that I have put them in the chat, and you can also find them in the resources section. If anyone does have any troubles accessing them, just pop in a message in the Q&A bit and I'll pick it up and I'll resend it to you. But yeah, other than that, all good. Thank you, Tim.
Lovely, thank you, Lauren. So yes, so now I'm going to talk about what makes a good measure. So we've talked a little bit about understanding your process. We've talked a little bit about what a KPI is, what a leading measure is. So thinking about our leading measures, think about the things that we are going to be trying to measure on a daily, weekly basis in order to be confident that we're going to be delivering against that big KPI. There are a few rules that I find really helpful to choose what those measures should be. And because everything needs to have an acronym and a word that you can sort of hang it off, this is called Puma. I've had to force it a little bit. Apologies for that. So anyway, the anatomy of a good measure is Puma, and the P in this is aligned to purpose. So what is the purpose of this process? What are we trying to achieve? And you might have, for example, you can also use this for measuring team, for team measurements. We as a team, what is our purpose? What are we here to achieve? Because going back to that thing before about how do we how we are measured determines how we behave. If our measures aren't aligned to our purpose, if the measures that we are choosing are not aligned to the purpose of this process, then we're not going to end up with, we're going to be following the wrong things. We're going to be following a breadcrumb off in another direction. So when you think about if the purpose of the process is to install is successfully install a widget at a customer's house within the agreed amount of time and have a happy customer at the end of it, then we will measure different things. But if we start measuring how much did it cost us and other things, then we will make different decisions. Okay. Neither one nor the other is better. I would always argue that nobody ever went wrong by making their customers happy, but you need to be aware that what's the purpose of the process? Your leading measures need to be aligned to that purpose. The second one is they need to be easy to understand. And that will be, and everyone needs to understand them the same way. They need to be clear and understood. This goes back to my piece at the top about things being opaque and measurements often being opaque and confusing. There are often lots of acronyms or abbreviations, and there could be different understandings of what a measure is. I had a conversation with one of my clients earlier this week where there has been a genuine misunderstanding between two people about what about the content of a particular measure, which has meant that an entire piece of work that one of them has been working on has reached some conclusions that other people in the business don't agree with, and it's causing a bit of kerfuffle. And it's causing a bit of kerfuffle because the two understandings of what that measure are different. So the measures themselves need to be really easy to understand, and I like to write the definition of the measure underneath the name really, really clearly. It needs to be, it sometimes gets referred to as an operational definition. So really, really clear, this is how the measure comes through. So it needs to be easy to understand. It ideally needs to be easy to measure. If we have, bear in mind that these are your leading measures. These are the things that you are going to be looking at on a daily basis, a weekly basis, probably no more than weekly if you're in a month-long sort of KPI cycle. Sometimes they're things, depending on your industry, you might be looking at on an hourly basis. So they need to be easy to measure. If you've got a system that's introducing a 24-hour delay, then you're looking in your rearview mirror again. It's not it's no longer a leading metric or as leading a metric. One of the best examples of this that I worked on, and one of the most effective examples of this that I worked on, was I was doing some work with a team, a call center team, and the system that they were working with only told them their success rate from a point of view of whether they were on target with the calls that they needed to make. Only told them that number the following morning. So the first conversation they had the following morning was, right, we were 18% down on the good calls we did yesterday. That means we need to do 18% more today. Guess what? It didn't help. It just meant that they ended up getting bigger and bigger targets that they continued to miss. So the first thing we did was we stuck a flip chart by every bank of desks, and every time somebody successfully completed a call, they just put a tally on the flip chart. And at the end of every hour, we count them all up and go, right, where should we have been by now? Where are we right now? Right, we're 3 calls down. Okay, can we push in the next hour to try and complete those 3 calls? it meant that it was, I mean, super low tech. It was ridiculously low, but the impact was great because it was easy for us to measure. And we weren't reliant on systems, and we weren't relying on system access, and we weren't reliant on algorithms, we weren't relying on that. It was just like, how are we doing? So the easier something is to measure, the more likely you are to be able to get it quickly, the more likely you are to be able to use it to make decisions. There is one caveat to this, which is that a lot of organizations fall into the trap of measuring things because they can and not because they're the right thing to do. There will be, I will go out and say there will be probably one or two measures in your organization which you're looking at because that data is available and not necessarily because it's useful. And in those cases, you really do need to challenge as to, if this is not useful, why are we reporting on it? Why are we targeting on it? And what would we use instead, ideally? And go and get that. So that's the only caveat to that, is just because something is easy to measure, it doesn't mean you should use it. But what you are using should be easy to measure. And the A of Puma is you should be able to influence it. There is no point having a leading measure in your team that you cannot do anything about. It might be useful information for you to have as context, but if your team, if the team who are looking at this measure on, you know, in there and are trying to think of ways that they can be sure that they're successful, they cannot influence it through things that they do, then it's not the right measure. So to recap, it should be aligned to your purpose. It should be easy to understand. It should be easy to measure, and you should be able to influence it. And if you can do all of that, if you can tick the box on all of those 4 things for that measure, the chances of the people who are doing the work to be able to influence, to change that number, and ultimately, therefore, change that big blob KPI at the end of the quarter improves. So now we can start thinking about what our input measures are, what our leading measures in that template are. So I've put 3 here, and they are, doesn't need to be 3, there might only be 2, there might only be 1, there might be 6. 3 fitted on the page nicely, so that's what we've gone for. So a little bit of space, you can write in what the measure is, and you can, and there are 3 things that it needs, which is, what's the target? You've got to have a target, because now that target might just be maintaining a certain level, that target might be increasing it to a certain level, but you need to know what good is. And ideally, in the case of leading inputs, those targets would be the numbers that we hit that will serve us in achieving what we're trying to do with our output KPI. So if our output KPI is that we need to increase profit by 2.5% by the end of the year, our input measure targets should be built with that increase in mind. Frequency. How often are we looking at this? How often are we measuring it? How often are we talking about it? Some things it will make sense to look at daily. Some things it will it'll make sense to look at weekly. Some things, like I mentioned before, depending on your situation, it might be hourly. It might be twice daily. So what's the useful frequency for us to look at it? How often do we need to course correct? And you need to have an owner. The owner is not the person responsible for doing and delivering all the work. Their responsibility is to collect and present the information. Ideally, if you have within the team 3 or 4 people who are responsible for different measures, it just means that and maybe they're the person who's closest to that part of the process, or maybe they're the person who has a particular influence over a certain part of the business. But they should be the person who is, and they should really know how that information for that measure is collected, and what happens in order to present it. And if you have performance boards that you put your daily or weekly performance on, then they'll be responsible for updating those. So every of these measures should have an owner. So if you're playing along at home and you've got this template, you've downloaded this template from resources, just have a little think about what those might be, and you can start to use this to build the beginnings of a dashboard or a scorecard for your process. Now, the third kind of measure that's really important, and this deals with that third problem, remember, our third problem was the way we are measured determines how we behave. And so a balancing measure is something that we use in order to make sure that we are not unduly influencing undesirable behavior. So it's a measure that is not necessarily directly related to our central process, but it's a measure that is related to the desirable or undesirable behaviors that might be exhibited by someone who is trying to game the system. So if you think about this from the point of view of, if we are targeted on reducing costs in a particular area, so say in our widget creation place, one of the departments is targeted on reducing costs. Well, a way of them doing that would be to maybe use cheaper materials to manufacture the widgets. That could lead to quality problems. So your balancing measure here would be to do with the quality of the final piece, number of defects, or how long the widget lasts, something like that, to measure that. Okay, we want you to reduce cost, but we don't want quality to suffer. It could be that if you want to increase the speed of a process, that we are not inadvertently introducing. We're not inadvertently encouraging people to finish a job early or to rush through it. So certain balances that might need to be had to happen in there. So as I say, they're not directly contributing to your output KPI. They are more related to the target and measure of your leading measure to offset or to discourage or to flag undesirable behaviors as a result of that measurement. I think these are really, really important. So to get to these, I would tend to, and the benefit of trying to get to these is that people are very, very good at thinking the worst of people. We're all really, really good at thinking the worst of people. The effort that it takes to always be, everybody has, to always kind of give people the benefit and doubt, stuff like that. We all have to think about that a lot of the time. So if you get a bunch of people together, go, right, if we measure people on this, what are all the things they could do to gain the system? You will get tons of stuff really, really quickly. It is not a difficult process to go through and work out what you need to balance and measure. And generally what I would say is that just needs to be maintain X standard. You don't necessarily, your target doesn't really need to be improving. It's more about just we need to not see a drop in whatever this measure is in order to be confident that we're doing things the right way. And I'll put a space for it at the bottom, look. So for each, now you might decide you need more than one per input. You might not decide you need one. But in this case, we've got a balancing measure for each one of our input measures. So we can say, we want to make sure that we are having good conversations with our customers, and remembering to check in on our customers, even if they're not getting in touch with us, in order to find how things are going once every 2 months. And that might be our balancing measure for reducing the amount of time that we spend on outbound calls. And then that would be your target. I don't know, I've just made that one up, so it might not make any sense, but I think you see where I'm going. This is something that we're trying to achieve. This is a way that we might do it badly. Let's measure that to make sure we're not doing it. So using this gives you a nice skeleton for starting to build if this is our KPI for this process, these are all of the things that we're trying to achieve. We know that these are good measures because we followed Puma and we've ticked those bits off, and we've thought about the balancing measures that are going to feed in to our process. I realize this has all been a little bit abstract, so I've built an example here for you. So our output is that this is a marketing marketing department. So the and I've chosen marketing department because knowledge work also has measurement. It's very easy to think about this as just being about physical things being produced. But knowledge work within an organization does also have measurement, and sometimes it's harder. So this is why I've picked this particular example. So the output is that associate time is charged to an account is within an agreed budget 95% of the time. So presumably this is happening because employees were over servicing accounts. Were charging too much time to accounts, and therefore it was affecting profit. And the process that this is a measure of is the creation of marketing strategy and execution plan for WidgetGo. So we work for the marketing company who are working on the marketing strategy for WidgetGo. And we need to make sure we're not overcharging our budget. So most of the time, and we recognize that sometimes these things happen and we need to go above and beyond, but 95% of the time, we want to make sure we're charging within the budget to that account. We don't want to go over the budget. And so we go through the process and we look that we want to reduce the number of hours spent on non-contracted client requests. So in going through this process, we looked at it and gone, actually, you know what we're doing? We're doing lots of stuff for free. Lots of stuff that they're just asking us that we could do, and it's not included in our contract, and it's just racking up the time that's impacting our profit. So we just need to, and we're not saying that we want to not do any at all, but we really need to keep that down. We also identify we spend a lot of time reviewing and editing final presentations, all that moving things 3 pixels to the left and 2 pixels up, and having long arguments about whether it's the right word or not. It's eating into the time we spend on it. So actually, we need to keep that down, less than 1 hour per presentation. And we're going to check that monthly, and John's going to be in charge of that. And finally, we looked at it and went, crikey, our senior people are really, really involved on the day-to-day delivery of this account. Like far more than they should be. They're the most expensive people, and they're doing far more than we've budgeted for. So we need to make sure that we're keeping the senior associate time down. So that should be less than 20% of the total amount of time spent on the of the project. And Jana is sufficiently senior to be able to have those conversations and measure that. So that's why Janet is owning that. I mean, and we need to keep on top of that weekly, because these people are passionate and get excited, and they'll come into work with an idea and they'll spend a bunch of time working on that, but actually it's not in the budget. Now, of these, you look at it and go, actually, if we're going to reduce the amount of time we're spending reviewing and editing presentations, what if the quality drops? Quality might drop. Okay, so we're just going to put a balancing measure in there, which is making sure that we have we're not seeing an increase in the number of feedback points from the client. So when we send that presentation over to the client, ideally it would be exactly what they wanted, and we've understood it properly. On average, we want to see less than 1 per presentation. So if we get one bit of feedback every now and again, that's fine. But ideally, we don't want to see that number increasing because we're spending less time editing. So that's what it might look as something that and hopefully you can see how the hours how by cutting down the non-contracted time here, and by making sure we're not spending extra over processing time on our presentations, and reducing the amount of senior time that shouldn't be on there that we're not budgeted for, just keeping track of those things in a very clear way, that's going to help with the output. So you can see that, and some of this, none of this stuff will be a surprise to anybody in the team. You know, they'll all have seen it, but by putting it into words and putting a time and an owner for reviewing those measures, that's how you start to be able to change things. Because if you are paying attention to it, then it will get fixed. And that was everything that I had to talk to you about. Do we have any questions?